Welcome to NatSec MTech, a podcast designed to push the boundaries of national security and emerging technologies. If you are curious, or even a little concerned about how edge technologies are impacting our security interests and where the law stands in the equation, then you are exactly where you need to be. I am your host, Laura Donohue, Professor of Law at Georgetown and the Director of the Center for National Security. Join me here as we explore the world of AI, VR, space, cryptocurrencies, biomanipulation, and more, all with the goal of building a safer, smarter, and stronger future. Let's dive in. Hello, and welcome back to NatSec MTech, a podcast focused on driving the national security and emerging technology conversation forward. With us today is Todd Pennington, who is the Senior Research Fellow at National Defense University's Institute for National Strategic Studies. He's also an adjunct professor of law here at Georgetown Law and a senior fellow with the Center on National Security and the Law.
Thanks, Laura. Happy to be here.
So today is all about just laying out SpaceLaw101. For people who are new to the field, it can be a morass of different laws, international laws, domestic laws, different regulatory regimes. And the aim of the discussion today is to clear away all that confusion and just present a very clear picture and understanding of U.S. space law, as well as how it fits particularly with international law.
Sure. Before I do, I've got to drop my standard government disclaimer that the views I expressed today are my own, not necessarily those of DoD or National Defense University.
So I'd like to start actually by going back on the concept of ad Coelum, which really originated during Justinian times and became, first of all, an aspect of civil law on the continent of Europe, and then transferred into the United Kingdom and then became an aspect of common law. This idea that individuals who own the land own everything down to hell up into the heavens above. Can you talk a little bit about ad Coelum in the context of both its evolution in history and particularly what happened when humans started going into space in the mid-20th century?
Yeah, this principle, it was really more of an axiom that, described how people thought about the law. It wasn't necessarily construct that judges ruled on, but it was mentioned in different cases. As long as humans were essentially earthbound, that sufficed for a lot of purposes. You had cases involving overhanging trees or jettying buildings, kind of was the extent of things. It was obviously aviation started to change that, balloons first, and then later airplanes enabled and raised new questions about that. And there was differing views. There was a lot of scholarship on it, some comparing the air to the high seas. Is it the same principles as navigation on the high seas? And others, pointing back to ad Coelum as the framework. It was really World War I that cemented the law on this as the military utility of aircraft became apparent. And as states managed these aircraft that were coming and going across national borders, but ended up settling on the framework of aviation law that is endured to today, which is basically that national sovereignty extends from your territorial border up into the air. And of course, at the time of World War I, into the air was about as far as people thought about it. There was no reason to have a legal framework that governed space. So when the prospect of space travel became meaningful, really during World War II. The V-2 rockets demonstrated the capability to escape Earth's atmosphere, travel through space to another country. These questions really got put on the table. Rand first proposed preliminary design, a world-circling spaceship, it was called, in 1946. Missile technology followed, and those missiles were leaving Earth's atmosphere in the course of their transit. And then, of course, Russia finally launched Sputnik. Prior to Sputnik, Russia had actually asserted that the principle of territorial airspace extended out indefinitely, and that overflight in space was a violation of national sovereignty. But then, when they launched Sputnik, a few months later, the U.S. launched Explorer 1 to have its own on-orbit space capability. And very quickly, this idea that you can overfly a country in space quickly became accepted and then expressed in the 1963 Principles Declaration as a UN General Assembly resolution, and then ultimately codified as the first article of the Outer Space Treaty in 1967.
So this is interesting so we have these Air Force-based programs and overflight of the Soviet Union, and there's protests to that, but it's okay as long as that overflight takes place outside the Earth's atmosphere, which is where Sputnik would have into low Earth orbit. All right, so in 1963, we have these first principles agreed by the United Nations. Between 1963 and 1979, we have a flurry of instruments that are introduced. And so let's talk about those instruments.
Sure.
So we have the Outer Space Treaty in 1967. We have 112 states party. What's interesting is as these agreements go on, the number of states party actually reduces. So we have fewer and fewer countries signing up to these agreements over time. Can you talk a little bit about the Outer Space Treaty and where it came from, what its general contours are?
Yeah, so the Outer Space Treaty, there's a couple of ways of looking at it. Some folks look at the Outer Space Treaty as coming together to provide a framework for the peaceful use and exploration of this new domain. Principle of overflight came to be accepted. It was not with unanimous agreement as to its scope. Russia would still make rumblings about, well, you can overfly for peaceful purposes, but if you're overflying intelligence satellites, that's a problem. That there was Bogota Declaration that asserts an equatorial state declaration of some special status regarding the geostationary Earth orbit belt above the equator. But lots of this new domain could have military utility. And certainly the entanglement of space technology and military utility was keenly felt by everyone at the time, especially the Soviet Union and the United States. And the other school of thought about the origins of the Outer Space Treaty is that it is one of a series of treaties that dealt with that tension of access. How do we prevent conflict from spilling over there, either because we want to prevent conflict or because we want an adversary to not gain an advantage? The Outer Space Treaty, in many ways, is actually a follow-on to the Antarctica Treaty of 1959, where some of the ideas were first expressed. The idea of no station of nuclear weapons, the idea of limiting further claims, the idea of non-appropriation in the Outer Space Treaty. So that was very much a framework that was looked to. And then early in the 60s, in 1963, UN General Assembly resolution articulated principles of space law, and many of which we later see in the Outer Space Treaty. It wasn't a legally binding treaty instrument, but it was certainly an expression of how states were coming to view what the rules of the road were in space. There was a desire to capture those principles in a legally binding treaty. And of course, it took some time to develop. There's things states want to capture in a treaty because they want to have a positive legal basis to do it, and there's a positive legal basis to prevent somebody else from doing it. And both of those we see in the Outer Space Treaty. And so in 1967, just a decade from Sputnik, it's amazingly fast maturation of a new capability into essentially a framework treaty. The Outer Space Treaty captures many of the broad strokes of the principles of outer space law, but it's very much a framework that's further implemented by the other agreements that you mentioned.
So it's interesting because you mentioned law of the sea initially. And yet it seems that the Space Treaty, with the cornerstone of international law regarding space, actually draws on Antarctica, which is a totally different model. The principles around Antarctica have to do with research and development, with scientific knowledge, with this idea of exploring what's possible. Whereas law of the sea has to do with things like territorial jurisdiction and laws of combat and ways of interacting if you happen to run into each other on the high seas. So have we adopted a model which is more Antarctica-based?
Many of the principles out of the Antarctica Treaty that you see in the Outer Space Treaty, you see with respect to the moon and other celestial bodies, more than with free space through which satellites can orbit. But not exclusively. The Outer Space Treaty includes, at Article 4, a prohibition on the stationing of nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in space. That's also found in the Antarctica Treaty, and it applies to space, agnostic of whether it's free space or a celestial body. But Article 4 further prohibits the testing of weapons of any kind. It limits the use and exploration of the moon to exclusively peaceful purposes. That reservation is not found for the rest of space. It's only for the moon and other celestial bodies. There is a prohibition in Article 4 against military maneuvers on the moon and celestial bodies. Those ideas are very comparable to what we see in the Antarctica Treaty, and they apply to some extent in all of space and to a greater extent with respect to the moon, which I think in 1967 was perceived to be more of an imminent threshold of human endeavor than it has turned out to be. Principles Declaration, you'll see a reference to space, but in the treaty, it is usually referred to as outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. So that was one of the advances that we see in the treaty.
So we have the Outer Space Treaty in 1967. Right away, we have the Rescue and Return Agreement. Did they forget something in the Outer Space Treaty? What's the story behind the Rescue and Return Agreement?
Well, I think it's fair to say, that all these other agreements are for the most part implementing principles that are found in the Outer Space Treaty. And so the larger principle kind of holds. And in the Rescue and Return Agreement, it's really two ideas are given a fuller expression. One is that astronauts are envoys of mankind, and this idea that, if an astronaut in distress comes to be in the territory of another state besides the state that launched it, they are to be returned to the launching state. You can imagine the Cold War dynamics of defecting military pilots that were of grave concern to the Soviet Union that prompted that provision. There was worry that astronauts would go to orbit and then defect to another country. And then there's the return aspect of that agreement. And we see those basic concepts in the Outer Space Treaty that talk about the enduring jurisdiction and control of space objects and the principle of state responsibility. The idea that is given fuller expression in the Rescue and Return Agreement is that if a space object returns to Earth outside the territory of the launching state, if it comes to land in another state's territory, there's an obligation to return that space object, which is not always the case with other state objects that come to be in a state's territory. For example, if you're China and you operate a high-altitude balloon over the United States, we will shoot that down and we will keep that payload. That is now our high-altitude balloon and payload because it came into our territory and we decided to keep it. But if that had been a space object that had returned, there would be an obligation to return that on request of the launching state.
What about the Liability Convention in 1972? Is that also what one might think about as a subsidiary instrument of the OST?
It is. So Article 7 of the Outer Space Treaty, provides that states are liable for damage they cause during their space activities. The Liability Convention does some things like establish standards. So the fact that for on-orbit space activities, if one satellite damages another in space, liability is based on who's at fault in causing the damage. Whereas if that damage occurs on Earth because an object returns to Earth and causes damage, or it's during a launch attempt or the like, that liability is absolute. And then the convention includes fairly robust in its claims adjudication process, provides for the establishment of a claims commission and the like. There's never been a claim adjudicated under the principles of the Liability Convention. The closest was probably the Cosmos 954 return of a Soviet satellite with a nuclear power plant. It wasn't a weapon, but it made an uncontrolled reentry over Canada, dispersed radiological hazard over a wide area. There was a cost to clean that up. That resulted in a payment that was bilaterally negotiated outside the mechanisms of the Liability Convention, except the convention provides for countries to, work it out if you can, and here's the process if you can't.
And as we will be discussing in later episodes, there are times now where commercial entities actually do that negotiation without the governments becoming involved. So SpaceX, for instance, if something falls on somebody's farm, then they can have negotiated directly with the landowner about what would be a reasonable compensation for that without the governments getting involved.
Well, the Liability Convention applies as between states. So commercial companies really have no standing as such so far. It's been a launch attempt in the United States that has rained debris onto area of the United States. So that's all a domestic legal matter for the United States. It's not really implicate the Liability Convention. Now, say SpaceX rocket attempted a launch and resulted in debris falling on another country. then there would be an question of international liability. And how SpaceX would play into that is, assume the rocket launched from the U.S., and it's a U.S. company, so it's going to be the launching state for that, under Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, and they're liable for the actions for their national space activities. So that would include activities undertaken by SpaceX, which are licensed by the United States pursuant to the authorization and continuing supervision of that state. So say this debris landed in Mexico. The U.S. and Mexico now may have a claim as against each other. And if the U.S. ends up having to pay damages to Mexico, then the U.S. might have a claim back in return against SpaceX. Although that's not it could be that the company that conducted the launch could work out something with the country that suffered damage through their own domestic legal processes and satisfy the liability that way. So that's part of why this mechanism has never been used. When damage has been caused, it's always been resolved outside of the need to have states work it out between states.
Representatives from SpaceX will be in future podcasts giving us the opportunity to talk about instances in which this has actually occurred.
And to be fair to SpaceX, they're by no means alone in having rockets blow up and cause damage. Everyone has, that's just price of doing business to learn how to launch rockets. It's a complicated undertaking that's part of it. Yeah.
Okay, so after the Liability Convention in 1972, there are two more kind of central agreements. Mm-hmm. One of them is the Registration Convention in 1976, and there are 73 states party to that. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that Registration Convention, why that came about, and what the contours of that are?
Sure. So the Registration Convention gives more expression to this idea of providing notices about the space objects that a state places in outer space. There is a UN Space Object Registry maintained by the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs. And actually that existed prior to the Outer Space Treaty. So there was already a registration process. The treaty then provided for states to make notifications about their space objects. And then the Registration Convention provides more of the mechanics of that. So it really is, in my view, a ministerial treaty about what kind of information, how does it get reported. Certainly states were registering their space objects before the convention existed.
Why do we see so few signatories as compared to the Outer Space Treaty?
I think if you're not a spacefaring state, why bother? And if you're not putting objects in space, you don't need to use the processes. The convention's always there for a state that gains a capability to operate in space. And so I think a lot of states have just not seen a need to do so until such time as they're going to join the community of spacefaring states.
So speaking of numbers, they plummet rapidly when we get to the Moon Agreement in 1979. Now, this is the agreement governing the activities of states on the Moon and other celestial bodies. So taking it out of that space-to-space navigation and putting it directly onto celestial bodies. Why only 17 or 18 states party? What exactly happened to bring that about, and what's the current status of that agreement?
Sure. Well, the Moon Agreement faced a couple of challenges. One, by the time it was being proposed, much of the state practice of space law had become much more mature. There was a lot more experience with what is likely to happen in space, what do space operations look like. There were more states operating in space. And there was just a better understanding of, if Outer Space Treaty and really sort of were designed to prevent an unexpected problem. And then there's the actual content of the Moon Agreement. The Moon Agreement includes some concepts that are a good bit more sweeping in terms of protection of and utilization of the moon. This idea that the moon is the common heritage of mankind. There's a commitment to provide for a to-be-decided international organization that will kind of adjudicate the allocation of benefit from the resources of the moon. There's a lot of uncertainty about what that might look like. Some of those similar considerations are why the U.S. did not ratify the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, and they are why many states did not sign or ratify the Moon Agreement. Of the 17 states that have signed onto the Moon Agreement or ratified the Moon Agreement, only one is a spacefaring state, Australia, and states actually have begun to withdraw signatures. So Saudi Arabia was a party to the Moon Agreement. They withdrew their signature, and so they're now no longer affiliated with the Moon Agreement framework. Brings the count of states that have signed on to the agreement to 17.
How many states are spacefaring countries?
It depends on how you imagine spacefaring. Certainly many states are using space services. States that have a satellite on orbit, last I counted, it was about 88. If you look at states that are capable of launching a satellite, it's fewer than that.
Great. So you mentioned the Bogota Declaration as well. Could you talk just a little bit about the year and kind of what went into that as well?
Sure. The Bogota Declaration, Equatorial states expressed a view that they had a special interest in the segment of the geostationary Earth orbit over their territory. Let me unpack that a little bit. The geostationary Earth orbit is a point in space, roughly over the equator, 0 degrees inclination, where a satellite's orbital period is 24 hours, or 23.87, whatever the Earth's rotational period is. So because it's over the equator and it's orbiting the Earth at the same rate that the Earth is rotating, it is seen from a position on the Earth to be static in the sky. It's moving on the same two-body dynamics as other satellites, but it has that unique operational quality, which makes it useful for satellite communications and missile warning and applications. So these states signed onto the Bogota Declaration and said, we believe we have a special status or a special claim to this segment of the geostationary Earth orbit. We should have a say in whose satellites operate there. The mechanism that actually prevails is the International Telecommunications Union, which regulates spectrum use, also registers who sits in what geostationary Earth orbit spot. Most spacefaring states did not recognize the Bogota Declaration, and in fairness, it's a bit at odds with some of the threshold principles of the Outer Space Treaty. This idea of the principle of free access and this principle of that outer space is not subject to national appropriation. And it is still a very viable claim that the concepts of the Bogota Declaration have not been acknowledged as a legal obligation by most spacefaring states. The Declaration states still assert it. In fact, Colombia acceded to the Outer Space Treaty last year in 2024, and when they did, they signed on with a reservation to their ratification of the treaty that referenced a provision of their constitution that essentially defines the territory of Colombia in a way that includes their segment of the geostationary Earth orbit. So that conversation continues.
Could you just say a quick word about LEO, MEO, and GEO and
Sure.
the distinctions between them? Because this will come up both today as well as in future segments on Space Law.
Yeah. In Earth orbit, for various reasons, uses have tended to cluster in 4 principal orbital regimes. The first is low Earth orbit, which is orbit from around 200 kilometers to maybe 1,700 kilometers ish. Well, in that area, space is the easiest to get to. You have the lowest launch costs to get there. You have the lowest latency for transmission of data. You have the best resolution of imagery. So there's lots of operational reasons that area of space is optimized in. Why 200 kilometers? Because below 200 kilometers, you start to experience the effects of the Earth's atmosphere, and it's hard to sustain in orbit. As satellites tend to get pulled into the atmosphere beyond those altitudes, the reasons for being in LEO start to attenuate. You want to be closer for lower resolution and all these kind of reasons. And you start to experience the effects of the Earth's inner Van Allen belt, which is a belt of radiation around the naturally occurring radiation around the Earth at that point. It's damaging to satellites to endure in that space and pass that distance. Within LEO, you also start to see some differences above and below about 500 kilometers. Below that, objects will tend to re-enter more easily because the Earth's atmosphere still has some perturbing effects that will grab a satellite over time. Above that, objects stay in space for much longer, getting into decades or centuries. Then as you go past low Earth orbit, you're in medium Earth orbit, which medium Earth orbit is basically everything between LEO and the geostationary Earth orbit. There's not a lot in MEO because there's not a lot of use cases optimized there, and you end up transiting through these Van Allen belts a good bit. Satellites that operate there long term have to be hardened, and that adds cost and complexity to operating the satellite. The main things that operate there are the global navigation satellite systems. So GPS, China's Beidou system has, Russia's GLONASS has satellites there, and the European Space Agency's Galileo satellites all operate there. It is by altitude a huge range of space, but that's the use that is clustered there because of the operating qualities. The geostationary Earth orbit I talked about a little bit already, that 0 degree inclination, which is how far tilted off the equator is the satellite operating. There's a number of orbital parameters that feed into that. Its altitude tells you how far away from the Earth it is. That altitude has an apogee, its farthest point from the Earth. Perigee, its closest point to the Earth, and between those it forms an ellipse. There's other considerations about the point on the equator where it crosses over and all these kind of things. You can add those up and figure out a lot of things about how satellites move. But at the 0 degree inclination, so more or less over the equator, satellites can move at a speed that matches the rotation of the Earth. You can see a satellite can hold a ground station in a continuous field of view. So for communications, your direct TV broadcasts come from GEO, your Sirius XM radio comes from GEO. Most satellite communications sit out in GEO, and a lot of missile warning sits out in GEO. Can also refer to a sun synchronous orbit, but that refers more to its design than its altitude. An orbit that is designed to always be over when the sun is in the same orientation is useful for intelligence imaging because you get the same shadows. So if you think about the use cases that are optimized in GEO, those don't work good at the regions of the poles, because the angle of view starts to get very high, which obfuscates the signal, which adds latency. And all to service polar regions, states put satellites in a highly elliptical orbit that covers the poles. And you can't have a steady stare over the poles because the Earth rotates along the equator, not over the poles. So you can't have a GEO kind of orbit over the poles. But what you can do is have an orbit that has a very high apogee over one pole, and a very close perigee over the other pole, and then it will tend to pass over its perigee pole very quickly and then spend a long time dwelling over that apogee pole. And so with a handful of satellites in train in a particular GEO orbit, you can have essentially continuous coverage over a polar region. So those orbital dynamics and those operational use cases have caused those uses to cluster in those major orbital regimes. There's other ways satellites and spacecraft can move in Earth orbit, but the vast majority of space objects are in one of those 4 orbits.
What about beyond Earth orbit? Mm-hmm. Is it these 4 distinctions for near Earth orbit and then the rest of the universe? Or are there distinctions within the beyond Earth orbit that are also relevant for thinking about space law?
Well, it gets gravitationally weird beyond Earth orbit because you can start to have gravitational effects that involve multiple bodies. So you have points in the Earth-Moon system where there's gravitational equilibrium at what's known as the Lagrange point. A satellite can orbit out around a point in space instead of around the moon. The mass of the moon is not as evenly distributed as the Earth is. Orbits close to the moon are less gravitationally stable than orbits around Earth. If you get further from the moon, that becomes more stable. And then with all these gravitational features in the Earth-Moon system, the 5 Lagrange points, the moon, the Earth, you can have resonant orbits that go around multiple features and that draw these flower petal shaped designs in space that get sort of just learning how to operate there. So there has been a handful of navigation and satellite experimental satellites launched, but there's still very much a space frontier. That's actually my thesis about space frontier areas, that some of these areas of the Earth-Moon system will start to see uses cluster before others, and then others will remain these frontiers that we can get to the Sun-Earth system, and you have the same dynamics there, but then the distances get so vast that you're talking about trajectories that endure for years. There's not a lot of use cases or very deep space, scientific experiments that go there today. In the future, who knows?
Where do you think we're going to see constellations or concentration in terms of the Earth-Moon system in particular?
Well, I think the Lagrange points have some obvious use cases. There's not a way to do a geostationary lunar orbit because the moon is tidally locked. So the moon doesn't rotate on its axis the way the Earth does. That's why there's a near side of the moon and a far side of the moon. If the lunar night comes and goes across the surface, over a 14-day lunar day and a 14-day lunar night. So if you want those use cases like you have in geo communications, you'd have to go to a Lagrange point. And there you can have essentially a near fixed view of one side of the moon, and helpfully for as long as humanity is based on the Earth, also of the Earth. So you can see the Earth ground stations, you can see the moon, you can see what's happening in lunar space, those Lagrange points, but they really are regions because, a spacecraft doesn't go to a Lagrange point. A spacecraft orbits a Lagrange point, and that orbit can be massive. They're not necessarily planar. Orbits around the Earth are planar. They're like a plate, but they get curved up in lunar space around the Earth.
And it's based on gravitational pull.
The interacting gravity of multiple gravitational features over time in a chaotically propagating trajectory. You can have useful cases that actually sit in non-repeating trajectories because the length of the transit can be so long that by the time it comes back around in the Earth-Moon system, everything's in a different place. And so it may never become a exactly repeating orbit, but may still stay in that space. So all those kinds of potentials are things that states are looking at as they look at the moon and beyond.
Todd, thank you so much for joining us today for what has been an incredibly insightful, thoughtful, and fruitful discussion, really laying out the basics for space law. It's been a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, same.
Thank you for listening to NatSec MTech. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to our channel and invite anyone who would like to join us. I will see you in the next episode. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking the big questions.